Welcome, dear friend, to Timeless Love. And if these stories bring you comfort in the quiet hours, a gentle subscription means a very great deal. Tonight, we begin at Ashverne Park in the year 1817, when the frost came early to the Vale of Westmere and did not leave. The East Lake had been silent since October, its surface sealed beneath a skin of grey ice that the weak December sun could not persuade to yield, and the reeds at its margin stood as stiff and pale as the letters of condolence one writes and never sends. The great house itself rose from its grounds with the particular authority of a building that has witnessed more than it intends to reveal. 3 stories of dressed stone, its windows reflecting the colourless sky rather than admitting it, its chimneys exhaling thin threads of smoke that the wind immediately erased. It was the kind of house that made one lower one's voice upon approaching, as though some observance were already underway within, and one had arrived a little late and a little underdressed, and not quite certain of one's welcome. The east wing, it was said in the village, had been closed since the previous summer. What was said beyond that tended to vary according to the speaker, and so no reliable account existed. Only the folding screens arranged along the east corridor, the wallpaper behind them faded to the colour of old bone, and the particular silence that settles upon rooms that have been told they are no longer needed. It was into this atmosphere, on the 14th of December in that frozen year, that Miss Clara Mowbray arrived. She was 26, and the hired carriage that brought her from the coaching inn at Westmere Cross was not a comfortable one, its leather seats cracked, and its windows admitting a thread of cold air. Her valise was small. She had always travelled with a small valise, having learned early that one is less encumbered by possessions than one imagines, and more encumbered by their absence than one expects. Her face, those who glanced at her in the entrance hall would later report, was unremarkable at first, a pale, composed arrangement of features, dark eyes that asked no immediate questions, a mouth neither generous nor severe. It was only when she was still and attending to something that the quality of her attention became apparent, and by then most people had already looked away. She carried, in addition to the valise, a memorandum book bound in dark green calfskin, its pages already half filled with observations she had made in other houses, in other corridors, on afternoons when the household was occupied elsewhere. She was come to Ashverne Park as companion to the Dowager Lady Ashverne, a position she had accepted with the quiet practicality that governed most of her decisions and which those who did not know her well sometimes mistook for indifference. Peel, the butler, received her at the door with the grave efficiency of a man who has managed a large house through its difficulties and intends to continue doing so. He showed her the principal rooms with a tour that was thorough in its omissions. The breakfast room, the morning room, the library, these were described in detail. The Duke, he noted, would not be present at dinner. He was engaged elsewhere in the house. The east corridor, should Miss Mowbray find herself uncertain of her direction, was given over to storage, and need not concern her. The portrait gallery, he added, as though it were a matter of no particular significance, was not currently lit, and visiting it was not encouraged until arrangements could be made for its proper presentation. Clara listened. She noted that he said the Duke was engaged elsewhere in the house, not elsewhere in the country, and that he did not say what the storage in the east corridor comprised, and that the portrait gallery had presumably been lit at some earlier point, before the arrangements had become unmade. She did not ask about any of these things. She thanked him for his care and was shown to her room. It was in the entrance hall, however, on the way upstairs, that she paused. Set into an alcove between 2 long windows, stood a large canvas, covered with a linen sheet, the kind of covering one uses when a painting is being moved or cleaned, or perhaps simply when one does not wish it seen. The sheet was not, in itself, remarkable. What was remarkable was the faint outline at the lower corner where the linen had settled against the frame, the suggestion of a woman's profile, the curve of a jaw, the intimation of an expression that Clara could not, from where she stood, determine. She looked for a moment longer than was perhaps polite, then continued upstairs. That evening, by the light of her candle, she opened the memorandum book and wrote what she had observed: the ice, the east wing, the omissions, the covered canvas, the outline at its corner. She was nearly finished when she heard, from somewhere in the floors above her, the sound of a door opening, a heavy door from the quality of it with old hinges, and then silence, without the sound of it closing again. She noted this also. Then she set down her pen, closed the book, and listened to the house arrange itself around her, in the dark. Clara Mowbray had learned in the 5 days since her arrival at Ashverne Park that the life of a companion was composed almost entirely of small acts performed for the comfort of another, and that those acts were, by their very nature, invisible. She rose before the household had properly stirred, dressed without assistance, and presented herself at Lady Ashverne's door at 8:30 precisely, having discovered on the second morning that 1/4 was too early, and 9 o'clock was an offence the dowager registered with a silence so weighted it pressed against the ribs. The mornings followed a pattern that Clara had come to know as one knows a piece of music heard repeatedly, not memorized so much as absorbed into the body. She read aloud from whatever Lady Ashverne selected, and the selection was rarely predictable. There were the sermons, dense and dry, through which Clara kept her voice steady and her expression composed. There was the London paper which the dowager received 2 days late, and received as though it were fresh, interrupting frequently to dispute the opinions of men she had never met. And there were on certain mornings when Lady Ashverne's mood turned to something softer, the novels, always presented with a faint air of reluctance, as though the book had been left behind by a careless guest, rather than chosen deliberately, and as though any pleasure derived from it would be an embarrassment to acknowledge. Clara read those passages with particular care, keeping her own enjoyment out of her voice, offering the prose as a service rather than a shared indulgence. Between the reading came the correspondence. Lady Ashverne received a considerable volume of letters, and Clara had been tasked with sorting them into 3 piles. Those requiring an immediate reply, those requiring a reply at some future occasion when the dowager felt inclined, and those which were to be set aside without comment and never spoken of again. The 3rd pile was always the largest, and Clara had learned not to wonder at its contents. She placed each envelope with quiet deliberateness, and if Lady Ashverne's sharp eyes watched her to see whether curiosity might betray itself in some small hesitation, Clara gave her nothing to observe. She had grown skilled, in her few years of dependency, at making her face a still surface. The household itself had settled around her in the way that households do, not with warmth precisely, but with a kind of pragmatic accommodation. She was below the guests, who spoke to her courteously enough when they remembered she was present, and above the maids, who called her Miss Mowbray, with a deference that held a faint distance she could not close. She belonged to neither world entirely, and she had decided in the sensible way one decides such things when the alternative is despair, that belonging was not what she had come to Ashverne Park to find. It was on the 5th morning that she first saw him. She had arrived in the breakfast room early, before the fire had taken properly, and stood at the window while she waited, looking out at the courtyard below. The frost had not yet lifted from the stones. The light was the particular pale grey of a winter dawn that has not yet committed to becoming day, and the courtyard was empty, except for a groom moving quietly toward the stables. Then the Duke appeared. He crossed the frost-bitten stones at an unhurried pace, his greatcoat unbuttoned despite the cold, his head slightly bent, his expression turned so entirely inward that he seemed unaware of the world beyond whatever occupied his thoughts. Clara watched him, because there was nothing else to watch, and because the sight of a man so completely absorbed in his own interior life was, in its way, more arresting than any outward display could have been. He passed within view of the window, and then, she could not have said why it happened, only that it did, he looked up. Through the imperfect old glass which distorted slightly at its edges and held within it the small impurities of its age, their eyes met. It lasted no more than a moment. He looked away first, and there was something in the manner of that withdrawal, not rudeness, not indifference, but something more careful than either, that stayed with her after he had gone from view, as a note of music lingers in a room after the instrument has fallen silent. She did not speak of it, of course. There was no one to speak of it to, and nothing, in any case, to say. That afternoon, Lady Ashverne summoned her to the small writing-room off the east corridor and placed before her a linen-bound book of household accounts. The quarterly tallies required entering, she was told. The weekly expenditures for the kitchen wanted reconciling. Clara accepted the book with both hands, as one accepts a thing of some small weight, and carried it to her room that evening with something she recognized, carefully, as satisfaction. It was her first real charge. In a household where she was accommodated rather than needed, where her presence eased discomfort without being the cause of ease, the book was a quiet proof that she could do something useful, that she had not come all this way simply to disappear, though disappearing, she admitted to herself, had been rather the point. The escritoire stood in the corner of Lady Ashverne's sitting-room as it had stood for 30 years, its green leather surface worn pale at the centre, its brass fittings gone the soft gold of things too long untouched. Clara had admired it quietly since her first morning at Ashverne Park, and so it was with something between pleasure and unease that she received the Dowager's instruction on a grey Tuesday in February to open the locked lower drawer with a small key the old woman pressed into her palm, and to sort whatever she found there into bills, correspondence, and items of no present use. There had been a pause before Lady Ashverne added, without raising her eyes from the fire, that Clara was to touch nothing bearing a red wax seal. She had said it as one says a thing that does not require explanation, and Clara, who had learned in her 6 weeks at Ashverne Park that the Dowager's silences were often more informative than her speech, had simply said, "Yes, my lady," and taken the key. The drawer, when opened, exhaled a scent of cedar and old paper, and something beneath that, the particular closeness of a space that has been sealed rather than merely shut. Clara drew on her cotton gloves and began. There were household bills in abundance, accounts from the coal merchant, from the chandler in the village, from a London milliner whose bills dated as far back as 1812. There were letters in the Dowager's own hand, copies kept for record, each bearing her careful signature. Clara sorted these into their respective groups with the methodical patience that had made her first useful in her father's small library, then in the schoolroom where she had taught, and now here in a house that seemed to run on the principle that usefulness and invisibility ought to travel together. She had reached the bottom of the drawer when her fingers found the bundle. It was tied with ribbon that had once been blue and was now the uncertain colour of an overcast sky, and it comprised perhaps a dozen letters, folded and sealed, though the seals had long since been broken, and addressed in a hand she did not recognise. The script was upright, formal, and very controlled, the sort of hand that suggested a writer accustomed to precision. She read only the salutation and the date before she stopped herself, because even in so little there was something that felt like looking through a door one had not been invited to open. The letters were addressed, in that careful script, to someone identified only as M. They were dated in a grouping that ran from April to October of 1791. Clara set them carefully on the desk. It was then that the door opened. Lady Ashverne entered without announcement and took in the scene at a single measured glance. The sorted bills, the gloved hands, the ribbon-tied bundle resting to the side. Her face did not change. She crossed the room, lifted the letters from the desk, with a steadiness that Clara noted precisely because it was too steady. The steadiness of composure maintained against the ordinary impulse to ask or explain, and placed them in the pocket of her grey silk morning dress. She said only that Clara had done very well, and that the drawer might be locked again. Then she sat down at the fire, and spoke no further of it. That evening, when the household had grown quiet and the candles on Clara's writing table cast their habitual uncertain light, she returned to the sitting-room on the pretence of retrieving a skein of silk she had left behind. She opened the lower drawer once more. The bills remained where she had stacked them, and otherwise the drawer was bare, but in the velvet lining, green velvet, faded at the fold, lines to the colour of old moss. There was an impression she had not noticed in the afternoon's business. It was oval, shallow, the outline of an object that had rested in that precise spot for so long that the fabric retained its ghost, perhaps 3 inches in height, 2 in width, the shape of a miniature portrait. Clara closed the drawer and went to the small table beside her bed and drew out the memorandum book she kept for household matters, pages of receipts and measurements and notes on the ordering of linen. At the back, where several leaves remained unmarked, she wrote in her smallest hand, letters in locked drawer, lower escritoire, addressed M, dated 1791, hand unknown, ribbon once blue, retrieved by Lady A without remark. Below this she wrote, oval impression in velvet lining, miniature, absent. She did not write what she suspected, or what the combination of these 2 facts might signify. She was not constructing a theory. She was simply doing what years among books had taught her, recording the existence of a thing, because things that someone has taken care to conceal are, in Clara's experience, the things that most deserve to be remembered. Rain had been falling since before the household rose, a low and patient rain that did not trouble itself with wind, but simply settled over Ashverne Park as though it had decided to stay. The gravel of the carriage sweep darkened to the colour of iron. The cedar on the south lawn dripped in long meditative streams. Indoors, the rooms contracted into themselves, and the library, which occupied the northwest corner of the house and received the least of any day's light, even in fairer weather, became a place of almost deliberate dimness, the 2 windows giving only a grey and watercolour version of the afternoon beyond. In this room, Clara Mowbray had been at work for the better part of 2 hours. She had been set the task by no one in particular, and therefore by her own conscience, of copying the household inventory into a clean ledger, the previous record being a confusion of 3 different hands across as many decades, with amendments in pencil that had since smudged to the texture of old fog. The library smelled as it always smelled, of cold leather bindings, of the coal smoke that rose from a fire kept at a level sufficient for the preservation of paper rather than the comfort of persons, and of something beneath both, a particular damp, not unpleasant, the damp of a room that has held things a very long time and does not mean to release them. It was the smell of patience, made architectural. Clara did not mind it. She had brought her own candle and set it beside the standing lamp so that her working corner glowed with a warmth the rest of the room declined to share. And she had, without quite intending to announce the fact, reorganized the cataloguing method. The previous system had ordered volumes by size and then by acquisition date, which was a system designed, she suspected, for the convenience of whoever had last added a book rather than for anyone who might subsequently wish to find one. She had shifted to subject and then to alphabetical order within subject, which required a good deal of penciled notation in the ledger's margins before the clean copy could begin. She did not hear the Duke enter. Edward Cavendish-Rell moved quietly for a man of his height, or perhaps the rain had covered whatever sound the door made. Clara became aware of him only when a shadow crossed the lamp, and she looked up to find him standing perhaps 6 feet distant, not looking at her, but at the shelves, his coat still carrying the faint cold of the corridor. He was searching for a particular volume. She understood this from the angle of his attention and the methodical movement of his gaze across the spines, and he did not find it at once. He found instead the evidence of what she had done. His eyes moved more slowly. He turned. "You have altered the arrangement," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a sentence that was waiting to become either a question or an observation. "I have," Clara said. "I apologize, Your Grace, if I have caused inconvenience. I should have asked leave." He studied the nearest shelf for a moment as though reading it. "It is correct," he said. Nothing more was added. She returned to her copying. He continued to search for the volume he had come for, and presently found it, near the geography of northern counties, where she had placed it with some confidence that it belonged. He took it down. He did not leave immediately. Instead, he stood at the window, the book in one hand, looking at the rain on the glass. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same quality it always seemed to carry, a flatness that was not coldness precisely, but rather the voice of a man who had long since stopped performing ease. "Do you find the house oppressive, Miss Mowbray?" The question surprised her, not because it was rude, it was not, but because no one had thought to ask her anything about her inner experience of Ashverne Park since the afternoon she had arrived. She considered the honest answer, which was also the only answer she knew how to give. "No," she said, "I find it interesting." He looked at her then, not for long, perhaps 3 seconds, and with an expression that was not quite readable, though it was not unkind. He said nothing further. He took the volume and left the room without ceremony, as quietly as he had entered, and the library settled again around the sound of coal and rain and the scratch of her pen. Clara looked down at the line she had been copying. She finished it, and then the line below it, and then several more. Her hand was steadier than she had expected. The candle burned without complaint. Outside, the rain continued its long, unhurried work upon the stone, and the house kept what it kept. The east wing of Ashverne Park had not been entered in Clara Mowbray's presence since the morning of her arrival, when the butler had listed its condition among the household's careful omissions. Locked, he had said, as though the word itself were a sufficient explanation, as though houses required no further accounting for the rooms they chose to seal. It was a fever that opened it at last. Lady Ashverne, who had spent 3 days insisting upon her own recovered constitution, succumbed before nightfall on the 4th, and by the following grey morning her colour was so poor and her temper so diminished that she submitted, for once, to Clara's quiet management without resistance. She required, she said, a particular shawl, pale blue cashmere, embroidered at the borders with small silver leaves, and it was kept, she said, in the cedar chest at the far end of the east wing passage, second room from the stair. The key was in the escritoire drawer, the small brass one, underneath the paper she did not use. Clara found the key precisely where the dowager had described, which suggested that the location had not been entirely forgotten, only avoided, and she carried it along the corridor toward the green baize door with a composure she was careful to maintain. For composure, she had long understood, was among the most useful qualities a woman of her station could cultivate. The door swung inward without difficulty, its hinges better kept than one might have expected for a passage that had seen so little use. The air that met her was cold in the particular way of rooms that no fire had touched in years, a still, cedar-edged cold, faintly sweet and faintly sorrowful, and in the grey light that fell through sheeted windows, the shapes of covered furniture stood like figures that had agreed, long ago, to remain motionless, and to ask nothing of those who passed among them. Clara moved through the room with care, her half-boots soundless on the stone flags beneath the dust sheeting, noting the outline of a writing table here, the silhouette of a tall press there, the humped forms of chairs pushed to the wall, as though making room for an occasion that had never arrived. The cedar chest was where Lady Ashverne had said it would be. Clara knelt, lifted the lid on its slow hinges, and found the shawl folded at the top of its contents in tissue paper, the silver embroidery as fine and undimmed as though it had been packed the previous week. She lifted it with both hands and was about to rise when the quality of the light at the far end of the room drew her attention. A different quality, warmer, less grey, as though something there was not sheeted, and therefore caught what small illumination the winter morning provided. She looked. Against the far wall, between two covered canvases of substantial size, hung a portrait uncovered and unsheeted, as though whoever had attended to the rest of the room had reached that particular canvas, and then, for some reason she could not know, paused and gone no further. It was the portrait of a young woman. She stood three-quarter to the viewer in the manner of the 1790s, her dress of ivory silk falling in the high-waisted line fashionable in that decade, a small spray of white flowers pinned at her shoulder. She was perhaps 18 or 20 years of age. She had grey eyes, clear and level and a little serious, and her jaw was set with a particular quality of quiet determination that Clara had encountered before, in this house, in a face otherwise entirely unlike this one, in expression and in years. The Duke's eyes looked back at her from another person's face, the same grey, the same steadiness, the same faint quality of seeing more than they allowed themselves to show. The jaw was the same jaw, the brow the same brow, and the recognition moved through Clara, not as a shock, but as a slow settling into certainty, the way a key turns when the mechanism it was made for is found at last. She stood before the portrait for a long moment and did not move. Below the canvas, at the base of the frame, a small brass plate was mounted in the position where a name should properly be engraved. It had been removed. 4 small screw holes remained in the gilded wood where the screws had been drawn out, and the pale square where the brass had sat was marginally less darkened than the surrounding frame. A ghost of an absence, a deliberate erasure performed with some care, yet not quite thorough enough, for the ghost remained, as such things often do. Clara looked at it for the span of several quiet breaths. Then she turned, the cashmere shawl folded across her arms, and walked back through the sheeted room and through the green baize door and along the passage to the dowager's chamber, where she settled the shawl about the old woman's shoulders and answered questions about the chest's condition with the mild attention she gave to all matters of household management. She said nothing of the portrait. That night, by the light of a single candle in her own small room, she opened her memorandum book to a blank page and drew from memory the face she had seen, the grey eyes, the set jaw, the ivory silk, working with the care of a woman who understood that the accuracy of a record matters most precisely when no corroborating record exists. She wrote beneath the sketch the date, the location, and a single, quiet observation: that the woman in the portrait had the bearing of someone who should have had a name upon her frame, and that the removal of that name had been, whatever its occasion, a thing worth the keeping. The library at Ashverne Park had its own weather. When the wind came off the park in those short December afternoons, the casement nearest the writing table breathed cold along its sill, and the coal fire, which had for weeks been kept at a miserly height, threw barely enough warmth to dry the ink before it dulled. Clara had learned to sit with her back to the wall and her shawl drawn close, and she had said nothing of it because she had said nothing of most discomfort since her arrival, having found that the house rewarded patience more reliably than complaint. The annotated pages appeared on a Tuesday. She came after luncheon and found, laid precisely beside her open ledger, 3 sheets covered in a hand she did not yet know but recognized at once as careful. The kind of care that conceals intelligence rather than advertising it. The corrections were to her cataloguing of the South Wing expenditures, 2 figures transposed, 1 entry dated to the wrong quarter. Beneath the last correction in smaller letters, a question: whether the drainage assessment she had noted in passing referred to the east meadow or the lower field. The consequences of each were rather different. She answered in the margin and left the pages where she had found them. The following afternoon they were returned, the question resolved, and beside it a small sketch, not decorative, not in any sense a flourish, but functional and exact. A cross-section of the estate's eastern slope, with the likely path of the problem water marked by a single steady line and 2 possible remedies noted in columns. It was the drawing of a man who thought in diagrams when words became imprecise. Clara set it with the other estate papers and filed it carefully, because it seemed the kind of information Ashverne Park had needed someone to record for rather longer than she had been present to do so. On the 3rd afternoon, he was already there when she arrived. He did not look up. She did not speak. She found her place at the table and continued the work she had left off the day before, and the fire, still inadequate, still tended at a steward's estimate of what a companion required, ticked in its grate, and the afternoon light moved across the bookshelves in its usual slow and indifferent way. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers holding one another at arm's length, nor the silence of those who had nothing left to say. It was the silence of 2 people who were, for the first time in a good while, adequately occupied, and who had quietly agreed, without negotiating it, that this room would permit such occupation without demanding performance. It was on the second of those afternoons that Clara first noticed the gesture. He reached for a document on his left, and as he set it down, his right hand crossed to his left and pressed briefly at the knuckles, a small, habitual thing, barely visible. The kind of action a person performs so many times it has ceased to be a decision. She might have thought nothing of it. She filed it instead in that part of her attention reserved for things that explained other things, and 2 days later she asked the housekeeper, in the natural course of a conversation about the estate's medical supplies, whether His Grace had any standing requirement for liniments or salves. The housekeeper had answered with the comfortable expansiveness of someone glad to have been asked. A riding accident, she said, in the spring of 1804, the same spring the old Duke had died, the same spring everything had shifted at once, and a young man had come home from one kind of grief to find another waiting. The injury had never set quite true. Cold weather worsened it. He never mentioned it. Clara had thought about this for one evening, and on the morning after she set upon the library table without remark or arrangement a small earthenware pot of the housekeeper's willow-bark salve, the kind the older servants swore by for old complaints that the cold reawakened. She said nothing. She did not remain to observe its receipt. The following morning the pot was gone. On the page of her ledger, in that same careful and precise hand, 2 words had been written in the margin beside a column of her own figures. "Thank you." She read them once. She returned to the figures. By the end of that week, the library fire was drawing properly, coal built high, before she arrived, so that by the time she settled at the table the room had already reached something approaching warmth. No one told her that he had spoken to the understeward. She did not ask. She understood that this was the vocabulary available to him, and that he had used it. And she found that it was enough, more than enough, to make the library the room in Ashverne Park where, for a little while each afternoon, everything outside it became considerably less present than the quiet work within. The illness came upon Lady Ashverne on a Tuesday, a slow, encroaching thing, beginning as a shiver she dismissed at dinner and deepening by midnight into something the house could not ignore. By Wednesday the doctor had been summoned twice, his boots tracking frost across the entrance hall each time he came and went, his expression composed in that careful manner physicians cultivate to say nothing while suggesting much. By Thursday afternoon the fever was established, and Clara had taken up her post beside the great canopied bed in a chair, drawn close to the fire, a single candle burning on the nightstand, the rest of the room receding into shadows that moved whenever a draught stirred beneath the door. She had not been asked to keep the night watch. There was no one else to do it. The household slept in its various corners, and Ashverne Park itself seemed to hold its breath around the sick room, the old timbers settling more quietly than usual, the wind drawing back from the eastern casements as though the house understood that noise was unwelcome here. Clara sat with a book open in her lap that she did not read, and listened to Lady Ashverne breathe. The delirium came in the deep hours of the second night. It did not announce itself. One moment, the old woman lay still, her face drawn and pale against the linen. The next, she turned her head and spoke a name with the clarity of someone addressing a person standing directly before her. Marguerite. She said it twice, with an intimacy that Clara had never heard in Lady Ashverne's waking voice, a voice that was always precise, always armoured. Here the armour was entirely absent, and what remained beneath it was something older and more sorrowful than Clara had imagined. What followed came in fragments, as fever speech always does, broken sentences, repetitions, silences in which the old woman's lips moved without sound, and then a phrase arriving fully formed and unmistakable. The child lived. She said it once, turned her face away, and then said it again, as though contradicting herself. Edward must never know the child lived. Clara did not move. She sat very still in her chair and allowed her breathing to slow, as one does when one is afraid that any motion will break a spell or end a confidence that was never meant to be given. More came. Not in sequence. Fever has no patience for narrative, but across the remaining hours before dawn, piece by piece, as though the thing Lady Ashverne had carried so long was too heavy to hold upright any longer, and was setting itself down whether she willed it or not. A marriage, Clara gathered. 1791. A chapel, somewhere across the water, the word Calais spoken twice in a tone that carried cold salt air within it. A woman, Marguerite, always Marguerite, of blood the old Duke had declared unsuitable, a phrase Lady Ashverne repeated with a bitterness that suggested she had never fully agreed with the verdict, only consented to enforce it. A child born in the months after, and then taken, given, the old woman said, with the particular anguish of one who has learned the difference between the two words too late, given to a family elsewhere, under another name, before the shame could settle upon the ducal house like sediment. By 5 o'clock, the fever broke. Clara heard the change in Lady Ashverne's breathing before she saw it, the shallow, rapid quality softening at last into something deeper and more regular, the tight lines around her mouth easing. By the time thin grey light had begun to find the gaps in the curtains, the old woman was sleeping naturally and without distress, her hands unclenched on the coverlet. She woke near 7. She was composed immediately, as though she had simply chosen to return from somewhere, and found the journey unremarkable. She thanked Clara for sitting with her. She asked whether the doctor had called. She observed that the room was cold and that the fire wanted attention. She remembered nothing. Clara saw it clearly, the untroubled surface of a woman who had spoken all night from the depths and returned to find the depths sealed again behind her. There was no evasion in her eyes, no careful watchfulness. She simply did not know. After the household had stirred and the doctor had made his final morning call and Lady Ashverne had been settled with broth and had fallen back into a natural, restorative sleep, Clara withdrew to her own room, sat at her small writing desk, and opened her memorandum book. She wrote every word she could reconstruct in the careful, even hand she had developed over years of recording things that mattered. She wrote without interpretation, only what had been said and in what order she had heard it. Then she closed the book, set it at the back of the drawer beneath her gloves, and told no one. She sat at the window a long while after. The park lay frost still below her, the bare limes casting their thin shadows across ground, the colour of iron. The east wing stood at the edge of her view, its windows dark, its door the same shade of weathered oak she remembered from the afternoon she had been sent for the shawl. She understood now what the portrait was. She understood whose face Edward Cavendish-Rell carried in the bones of his jaw and in the grey of his eyes, and had carried all his life without ever knowing from whom it came. She understood why the east wing stayed locked, and what it held, and what it cost the house each year it remained so. The frost on the inner pane thawed slowly as the morning deepened, and Clara watched it go and said nothing to anyone. The house at 2 in the morning was a different creature than the house by day, not merely quieter, but distilled, as though Ashverne Park had shed its performance of grandeur and stood at last in its own unmediated company. The entrance hall breathed cold stone and extinguished candle, the great staircase rising into darkness above, the marble floor pale as January ice beneath Clara's bare stockinged feet. She had not slept. She had lain in her narrow bed, with the ceiling above her, and the dowager's fever words moving through her mind in an orderly and unstoppable procession. And at last she had accepted that sleep would not come to a woman in possession of knowledge she had not sought and could not unlearn. She carried her candle low. The flame tugged sideways as she moved through the corridor, steadied as she paused, and threw her shadow long and unsteady against the wainscoting. She had told herself she was going to the kitchen for warm milk. She had told herself this with the composed certainty of a woman who knows she is lying to herself and proceeds regardless. The covered canvas stood where it had always stood, in the far corner of the entrance hall beside the tall case clock that never kept correct time. She had passed it a dozen times without allowing herself to stop. Tonight, she stopped. The sheet was linen, fine and heavy, dusty at the hem, and it came away from the frame with a sound like a withheld breath released. She held the cloth in one hand and the candle in the other, and looked at the portrait. It was a man. He was perhaps 30 in the painting, dressed in the scarlet coat and white facings of a cavalry regiment, the gorget at his throat catching a painted gleam. His hair was dark and dressed in the fashion of the last decade of the previous century, and his posture was the posture of a man who had been told to sit still for the painter, and was enduring the instruction with quiet discipline. His eyes were grey. They were precisely the grey of Edward's eyes, the same width of setting, the same particular steadiness of regard, the same quality of looking at a thing and being unwilling to pretend that it was not there. The face was not Edward's face, but it wore Edward's eyes in the same careful and undeceived way. The brass plate at the base of the frame had been removed, 4 small screw holes marked where a name had been. She was still holding the sheet at half-mast when she heard the footfall on the stair. He came down carrying a candlestick, a plain one brass, not the silver pair from the dining-room. He was dressed, or dressed enough, coat thrown over his nightshirt, boots unlaced, as though he had heard something or seen the light below, and come down without full deliberation. He stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom, and looked at her. He looked at her, and then at the portrait, and then at her again, and his face arranged itself into an expression she had not seen on it before, controlled, entirely controlled in the manner that is only necessary when the alternative to control is something one has decided not to allow. He came the rest of the way down the stairs. He did not speak immediately. When he did, his voice was low and even, as one speaks in a house where others sleep. He asked her what she knew. He asked her how long she had known it. Clara set the sheet down over the back of a nearby chair, as though tidiness was still relevant. She met his eyes without difficulty, which surprised her. She told him what she had witnessed, in the order she had witnessed it. She told him that the dowager had spoken in fever on the 2nd night of her illness, and the names and facts she had spoken, and that by morning she had remembered nothing. She told him of the portrait in the east wing scene when she had gone for the shawl, the removed nameplate only. She told him of the covered canvas, which she had not looked under until this evening. She told him what she had seen, and what she had been told. She did not tell him what she had concluded from these things. She had concluded a great deal. She kept it to herself because he had not asked for conclusions, and because the facts, spoken plainly and without embellishment, were already sufficient weight for a man to receive. He stood for a moment after she had finished. Then he crossed to the hall bench that stood along the near wall, a dark oak piece with a cushion that had faded from red to something closer to rust, and sat down on it, and put his face in his hands. Clara remained standing. The candles between them guttered slightly in some small movement of the house's air. She did not speak, nor move toward him, nor offer what he had not asked for. She stood, and let the silence be whatever it needed to be. The morning that followed was of the kind that arrives without ceremony, grey light, pressing softly at the curtains, the house still around it, save for the distant percussion of a kitchen fire being coaxed to life somewhere far below. Clara had slept only in intervals, her memorandum book closed upon the table beside her candle, and when she descended to the breakfast room, she found it empty, the tea cooling in its pot, and a single line written upon a folded card set against her cup. "Come to me when you are ready." There was no signature, but the hand was unmistakable. She found him in the corridor that ran along the east side of the house, that passage of cedar and shadow. She had entered only once before. He was standing before a door she had not noticed on her earlier visit, a narrower door than the one that gave onto the portrait room, its keyhole dark with disuse, and its brass plate gone the dull brown of old pennies. He did not greet her with apology or explanation. He held a key, and he looked at it rather than at her, and he said only that the room had been his father's private study, and that it had not been opened since the year 1804. Then he unlocked it. The smell that met them was the smell of paper, kept long in cold air, dry as pressed flowers, edged faintly with the sweetness of old wax. The room was small, its single window admitting a pale band of winter light across a writing table of plain, dark oak. The correspondence files were arranged in order upon shelves to the left, each tied with faded green tape and labelled in a clerk's careful copperplate. Someone, the first Duke or his secretary, had been a man of systematic habits, and the room bore that character still, orderly as a held breath. Edward moved to the shelves and ran one finger along the labels without speaking. Clara stood near the door, her hands folded before her, giving him the room and the silence equally. He found what he was looking for on the third shelf, a solicitor's letter, still sealed, the wax darkened with the years but unbroken. The direction upon it read in a formal hand to the second Duke of Ashverne, to be opened upon the occasion of a marriage inquiry. The seal bore a device she did not recognize, the mark, perhaps, of a firm long since dissolved. Beside the correspondence files, upon a narrow shelf of its own, sat a miniature in a gilt frame no larger than a gentleman's watch case. Edward lifted it, and was still for a moment before he turned it toward the light. Clara looked only briefly. A young woman in a high-waisted dress of ivory, her dark hair simply arranged, her expression containing the particular composure of someone who has been asked to sit for a painter and is determined to do it well. The face was one she had seen before, in the portrait room, in the gallery's covered canvas, and in the set of the Duke's own jaw when he was thinking of something he did not intend to say aloud. He turned the miniature over. On the reverse in ink, faded to the colour of old leaves, was a date, the 14th of April, 1791, and below it 2 names, written in the careful signatures of witnesses, men whose names Clara did not know but committed to memory from the librarian's habit she had never managed to lose. She looked away then toward the window and the frost-whitened grass beyond it, while Edward broke the solicitor's seal and read. She did not watch him read. She understood that his face would be moving through the kind of expressions that belong to a person alone, and she was resolved that he should be permitted that solitude even in her presence. The light shifted. Outside, a wood-pigeon settled on the sill and departed again. Somewhere in the house a door closed. Clara counted the panes of glass in the window and did not turn around. At last, she heard the careful sound of paper being folded, and then the softer sound of a coat receiving it. She turned. He was standing with his hand pressed flat against his chest, over the folded letter, as though steadying something within. His expression had passed through whatever it had passed through, and arrived now at a stillness that was not peace but was the thing that comes after knowledge, the moment when the question one has been carrying becomes simply a fact. He said, without inflection and without looking away from the middle distance, "She would have been my half-sister." Clara said, "Yes." The room held them both without comment, as rooms do when they have kept a thing a very long time and have finally quietly let it go. The cold that morning had settled into the brickwork of Ashverne Park as cold settles into old houses, not as an intrusion, but as a resident, familiar and unhurried, occupying the spaces between stones the way grief occupies the spaces between ordinary hours. When Edward Cavendish-Rell appeared in the doorway of the small sitting-room where Clara sat writing, his coat already buttoned and his gloves already drawn, he said only that he intended to walk, and that he would be glad of company if she was not otherwise occupied. There was no ceremony to it. He did not address the housekeeper. He did not summon a footman to accompany them at a respectful distance. He asked her, and the plainness of the asking was itself a kind of statement, though neither of them remarked upon it. The kitchen garden lay to the east of the main house, reached by a gravel path that ran along the base of the yew hedge, and the frost had gilded every stone with a thin and even brightness that made the walk feel quieter than it was. Clara had not been inside the walled enclosure since her arrival, and she found it more orderly than she had expected. The beds laid out in long, straight rows, the winter cabbages crouched beneath their coverings of woven cloth, pale and patient as sleeping animals. Against the south-facing wall, the espaliered pear trees spread their bare branches in neat herringbone patterns, each limb trained to the brick, with something approaching ceremony, though the fruit was months away, and the trees held nothing now but the memory of abundance and the cold architecture of possibility. They walked without speaking for some time, and Ashverne Park watched them go with the patient attention of a house accustomed to holding things quietly. The crunch of their footsteps on the frost-edged gravel was the only sound, save for a single wren that moved in the ivy at the garden wall and then was gone. It was Edward who spoke first, and when he did not speak of the solicitor's letter folded inside his coat, nor of the miniature, nor of the name written in faded ink on its reverse. He spoke of his father. He said that the late Duke had been, by most measures, a cautious man, not cold precisely, but careful in the way that men are careful when they have once been frightened and never fully recovered. He had managed the estate with rigour. He had not been unkind to those beneath him. He had discharged his obligations to the letter, but he had, somewhere in the winter of 1791, encountered something that lay outside the ledger of obligations, and he had found it insupportable. Not because he was wicked, Edward said, but because he did not know how to hold it. Clara said nothing. She walked at his left side with her hands folded in her muff, and she listened in the particular way that is not passive. That is a form of attention so complete the other person feels it as a form of presence, as if someone has drawn a chair close without making a sound. He said He did not know what was owed to a woman who had grown up as Eleanor Holt of Bath, who had perhaps never once suspected herself to be anything other than what she believed herself to be, and who had certainly never asked to be found. He said the word owed with a certain care, as though he was still deciding what it meant. Clara was quiet for a moment. One of the espaliered branches ticked against the brick as the wind moved through. She said, without looking up from the path, that the debt might not be a debt that required settlement in the conventional sense. That knowledge, the simple fact of knowing, did not always require action to justify its existence. That, to know the truth of a thing, even if one did nothing thereafter, was not nothing. It was, she said, perhaps sufficient in itself. He did not answer immediately. They completed the turn at the end of the long bed and began back toward the yew hedge, the house ahead of them with its stone face impassive in the winter light. After a little while he said only, "Yes." Not in agreement precisely, more in the manner of someone who has set a thing down and found they were able to walk without it. The cabbages did not stir. The pear trees held their careful lines. Ashverne Park received them back in silence, as it received everything, without judgment and without haste. The morning after the frost had eased its grip a little, not relenting, only shifting, as though the season had drawn a single slow breath. Lady Ashverne sent word that she wished to see Miss Mowbray alone, not in the drawing-room, where callers might intrude, and not in the small parlour where the dowager received tradesmen, but in her own sitting-room, the one that faced the bare lime avenue and smelled of dried lavender and camphor, and the particular sweetness of old silk that has been folded for years in a cedar chest. Clara came at 9 o'clock, as the note requested, and found her ladyship in the high-backed chair beside the window, a shawl across her knees that was not the one retrieved from the east wing, wearing the composed expression of a woman who has had the night to arrange her face and her intentions together. She did not open with pleasantries. Lady Ashverne had been in this house for more than 40 years, and she had long since set aside the ceremonies of approach for the convenience of arriving directly at the thing. She looked at Clara with grey eyes very like the Duke's, for the resemblance ran through the line on the maternal side, and Clara understood this now in a way she had not when she first arrived, and said that she knew something had changed in the house, not because anyone had told her, because the house itself had changed. It was not a fanciful woman's sentiment. It was the same attention she had paid to Ashverne Park, through seasons and deaths and the long silences between, and she trusted it, as she trusted very little else. Then she said the name aloud, Marguerite Solange. She said it without flinching, and then she said the rest of it. The chapel in Calais, in the April of 1791, the witnesses whose names she had seen on a document that the late Duke showed her once and then caused to disappear, the marriage papers suppressed within the year on the grounds of incompatibility with the family's position and the woman's origins, which were respectable, but not what the Cavendish-Rell title required. She said the child had been placed with a family of good character in the city of Bath, under the name Holt, and that she had been informed the child was a girl, and that the girl had been placed before she was old enough to carry any memory of her mother's voice or her father's house. She paused. The lime avenue was empty, and a single jackdaw crossed the pale sky with the deliberate slowness of something that has all morning to spend. She had kept it, she said, because a dying man had asked her to, not an unkind man, as she wished Clara to understand, a frightened one. He had been frightened of what acknowledgment would cost Edward, who was young and whose inheritance was already complicated by the entail and by the mood of the times, which were not hospitable to irregularity in great houses. She had believed, or had chosen to believe, that the keeping of it was an act of protection. She was no longer certain she had been right. She had not been certain of it for some years. There was a silence in which the fire spoke quietly to itself, and the lime trees stood still beyond the glass. She asked whether Clara had been kind to him. Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because it was not a simple one, and her ladyship would know if it were answered simply. She said that she had tried to be of use, and that she had not intruded where she was not wanted. She said that he had been kind to her, quietly, and without announcement, in the manner of a person who offers a thing because it is required and not because he wishes to be observed offering it. She said it plainly and meant it plainly. Lady Ashverne closed her eyes. She sat with them closed for a long moment, her hands still in her lap, the shawl rising and falling with her breath. She did not speak again. Later in the morning, after Clara had gone downstairs and then been called back to the corridor outside her ladyship's room when the Duke was announced, Edward came, and Clara heard his voice, low and without its usual restraint, through the closed door, and she drew herself back against the wall of the corridor and stood with her shoulders to the plaster, in the particular way she had learned across years of service in houses where she was necessary but not conspicuous, occupying as little of the passage as possible, becoming something the house moved around rather than through. She had learned the posture young, and she had never been glad of it exactly. But she was glad of it now, that she knew how to hold herself at the edges of things, patient and contained, while the rooms beyond their doors held what they needed to hold. The library at Ashverne Park held its breath through 2 evenings in the last week of February, the fire low and deliberate, the draught curtain drawn against the particular cold that crept beneath the east-facing door, once darkness had fully settled over the park. It was in this room, at the wide writing table that had served 3 dukes before him, that Edward Cavendish-Rell set himself to a task for which no precedent existed in any book of household management, in any guide to ducal correspondence, in any letter his father had left among the ordered papers of the private study. He was writing to a family in Bath whose name was Holt, and he was writing to tell them something they did not know, or perhaps something one among them had always half suspected, without ever possessing the words to hold it still. Clara sat to his left, near enough to be useful, far enough to make no claim upon the silence. He had asked her to be present in terms that were careful and brief. He said only that he might require assistance with phrasing, that he found the particular diplomatic register of such a letter difficult to locate by himself, and that she was under no obligation to remain if she found the hour inconvenient. She had said that she did not find it inconvenient, and she had taken her own small work, the household accounts for the week of the 12th, and settled into the chair without further ceremony, and that was how it began. He wrote slowly. On the first evening he produced 2 paragraphs and discarded them both, feeding each draft into the fire with a quiet deliberateness that Clara observed without comment. On the second evening he found the right register at last, the one that was neither too formal to seem human, nor too familiar to seem presumptuous, and the sentences came with the measured steadiness of a man who has decided what must be done, and has only been searching for the precise instrument with which to do it. He wrote that he was the natural half-brother of a woman who might be known in that household as Eleanor Holt, born in the year 1792, that he held documents attesting to a marriage contracted in April of 1791 and suppressed within the year, and that he asked nothing of her, nothing at all. He offered only acknowledgment, if she wished it. He wrote that the choice of whether to receive such acknowledgment was entirely hers, and that no reply was required, and that he would understand a silence as completely as he would understand an answer, because both were within her rights, and he respected them equally. He did not sign himself with his full title, but simply as Edward, which was, Clara thought, exactly correct. He sealed it himself, without asking her to witness the wax, pressing his ring into the dark red seal with the unhurried deliberateness of a man performing a sacrament in private. The following morning he took it to the post himself rather than delivering it to a footman, which was not a thing a Duke of Ashverne Park ordinarily did, and the house seemed to understand this, the entrance hall holding something lighter in its proportions when he returned than it had held when he left. He did not speak of the letter at breakfast. He read the Agricultural Gazette and asked whether the boiler in the laundry had been seen to, but Clara, watching without appearing to watch, perceived that some fraction of the weight he had carried since the evening in the portrait gallery had shifted, or perhaps not quite shifted, but released its grip slightly, as though a hand long clenched had been persuaded at last to open. Later that morning he came to her with the household record and said that he wished the text of the letter copied into it in full on the page following the entry for the 21st of February, 1817. She understood what this meant without requiring it to be explained. He was making the truth legible. He was placing it where it could be found, where it could be verified, where it could not be quietly unmade by time or convenience or the small private cowardice that passes for discretion in great houses. She copied it in her clearest hand, the one she reserved for documents that were meant to last, and when she had finished, she entered the date and her own initials in the margin, which was proper form, and which also felt, in some way she did not examine too closely, like setting her name alongside his in a record of something that had been worth doing. In the evening they sat by the fire, the grate doing its steady work against the cold, the room quieter than usual and easier in that quiet. He did not look at her when he spoke. His eyes rested on the coals, and after a long interval in which neither of them had found it necessary to speak, he said, "You have been more useful to this house than any person who has come through its door." She did not deflect it. She did not say that she had done very little, or that anyone would have done the same, or offer any of the softening phrases that women in her position had learned to keep ready for such moments. She simply received what he had said, held it, and let it remain. This cost her something, to accept plainly, without diminishing the weight of a thing truly meant, but she paid it without letting him see the price, and the fire went on burning, and the house around them settled into the deep silence of a winter night, beginning, very slowly, to ease. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried up from the hall and set beside the breakfast things, with the pale blue wafer seal and the Bath postmark, making it singular among the estate accounts that surrounded it. Edward saw it before Clara did. She was pouring the first cup from the silver pot when she noticed his hand go still upon the tablecloth, and she set the pot down and waited, because she had learned that waiting was the thing most wanted from her in moments that required no assistance. He broke the seal without ceremony. He read the letter twice. She counted the silence that way, as two complete traversals of whatever the woman in Bath had written, and then he folded it along its original creases and laid it flat beside his cup. He looked for a moment toward the long window and the winter garden beyond, where the pleached hornbeam stood bare and the gravel was sheeted in frost that had not lifted since early December. Clara attended to her own cup. She had developed over the months at Ashverne Park a particular skill for making herself unobtrusive without absenting herself, and she employed it now. When he spoke, he said that the letter was composed, that the hand was even, that the woman who called herself Eleanor Holt had written to say she had always understood she was not quite accounted for in the family that raised her, that there had been a quality of borrowed air to her childhood which she had never been able to name, but which had shaped her nonetheless, and that she was glad, that was the word she had used, glad, to be named at last, even at 35, even by a letter that must have cost its author some courage to send. Clara said she thought that was a generous word. He agreed that it was. She had refilled his cup before she understood, looking at him with the clarity that comes after long proximity, that he did not look the same as he had at every previous breakfast table. The slight bracketing about his eyes was unchanged, but the quality of it had altered. He did not look, as he had always looked before, like a man upon whose shoulders some invisible structure rested. The house still stood around him, its panelled walls, its proportioned windows, its long institutional quiet, but it seemed this morning to rest upon its own foundations rather than upon him, and the difference was not small. He turned from the window. He asked, with the careful formality of a man afraid of the wrong answer, whether she found Ashverne Park oppressive. She recognized the question. He had asked it in the library months ago, on an afternoon of cold leather and coal smoke, when she had been a stranger to him and he a stranger to her. She had said that she found it interesting. She had meant it then. She meant something different now, and she took a moment to find the honest form of it. She said that she found it, now, like a house that has put down something it had been carrying too long. He received this without speaking. The fire in the grate ticked and settled. A rook crossed the pale rectangle of the window and vanished. He looked at her with the directness he had come to use with her in private, not the closed, managed gaze he showed the world, but the steadier one he had learned, gradually, to permit himself. He said that he would like her to remain. He said it plainly, and then, because he was a precise man who had learned that imprecision between them served neither of them, he said that he did not mean as companion to his grandmother, who was recovered and in good spirits. He meant as someone whose presence he had come to rely upon in a way he could not account for, with the usual vocabulary of household arrangements, and that he understood this was not a casual thing to say, and that he would not have said it if he had not been certain it was true. He said that the East Wing portrait would be hung in the gallery. He had already spoken to the housekeeper. He would like someone beside him when it was done, not for ceremony. He did not mean ceremony, but because there are certain moments in the life of a house that ought to be witnessed by someone who understands the full weight of what they are witnessing. The frost held the garden in its particular stillness. Somewhere above, a casement moved in its frame, a small sound in the large quiet. Clara set her cup in its saucer. She felt, with a clarity she trusted precisely because it was not urgent, that she had arrived somewhere she had not known she was travelling toward, and that the arrival was right, and that right things at Ashverne Park had the quality of rest, of something long held being gently, at last, released. She said that she would stay. The house stood around them, patient as it had always been, its gallery waiting, and its east wing waiting, and its long winter beginning finally to soften at the edges, as winter does, when enough of what was frozen has been given over to the light.